Interruption there will be every so often when I ask to change slide. For some reason I've lost my internet connection here in Cardiff. I'm very sorry about that. Anyway, I'm delighted to be able to participate in this series of webinars and to have the opportunity to talk about my research project. Roman, if you could move to the introductory, the next slide please. Although the research has taken place in the UK only so far, I'm pretty sure that there's some relevance to other countries too, and I hope it will stimulate responses from you. I'm really looking forward to hearing your questions and comments after my presentation. So I've spent much of my working life running energy advisory services and programs to retrofit energy improvements to existing homes, and I've shifted my focus more to research only fairly recently. I'm pursuing this particular project as a PhD with the School of Architecture at Cardiff University here in Wales. So my topic is home energy improvements, and I decided to focus particularly on the views of mainstream building trades for reasons I'll explain. For many years, the programs I helped to run delivered mainly quite shallow retrofit and were driven by subsidies for different individual technologies, such as cavity wall and loft insulation, replacement boilers, heating controls and low energy lighting. More recently, the feed-in tariffs and a parallel scheme to support renewable heat has also driven an expansion in the small-scale renewables market here in the UK. But it struck me that while there is always public policy excitement at the growth of new jobs, the retrofit industry that grew around these programs had a tendency to disappear again when the subsidies stopped. And meanwhile, the mainstream building trades didn't seem to get involved much at all. It was also obvious that the drive was just to install the subsidised technologies, and lots of opportunities were being missed to go further and to achieve deeper retrofit. And even more importantly, every single day there are opportunities being missed to include energy improvements when homeowners get repair and maintenance done on their homes, or when they invest in home improvements such as extensions, attic conversions, new kitchens and bathrooms and so on. In the UK, this type of work, which I will refer to in the rest of this presentation as RMI, meaning repairs, maintenance and improvements, is mainly done by small enterprises. Nowadays, in fact, very small ones, typically with less than 5 personnel. And this sort of organisation tends not to join membership bodies or associations because these cost money, and so their views are rather rarely heard in policy circles. So this made them even more interesting for me to research, because it's a gap in knowledge. Could we move to the next slide, please? So here I'm just briefly going to describe the research approach. It's qualitative, with 59 semi-structured interviews and 2 group discussions to date. The biggest category is those offering general building services. You can see that I interviewed 26 general builders, but I also spoke to many other mainstream building trades, including carpenters, electricians, heating engineers, and so on. I've included at the bottom of this slide a link to a published report on the first part of the research, and in here you'll find references for some of the information I'm going to quote in the next few slides. Could we go to the next slide, please? So what is the challenge? Why does this thing about making energy improvements to existing homes matter so very much? Well, the first reason is that we're replacing the housing stock so very slowly. The UK's got around 20.7 million homes, and we're only building new homes at a rate of 100 to 200,000 a year at the moment. So actually, you can't solve the problem completely with new build. It is the existing stock that is the big issue that we have to tackle. Then you look at the fact that our housing in the UK is so particularly old and inefficient. About a fifth is pre-1919 and more than half is pre-1965. And you compare that to our energy and our carbon targets. We've agreed that in terms of our carbon targets for the whole country, our housing needs to be near zero energy by 2050. But not only is our old stock very inefficient, even the buildings we're building now are not efficient enough. So if you take 1 year as an example, the average home built in 2013 had a low B rating, and actually we need high A ratings to be meeting our modern targets. And then the other problem is that more than 80% of our homes are privately owned. So the big challenge is that we need to get private owners, building owners, to invest, and that's millions and millions of people making millions of decisions. And then finally, the risk of fuel poverty, because we're investing less and less in our own social housing. So that's the big problem, if you like. Could we move to the next slide, please? So we've said that the homeowner has to decide to invest, and there can be a lot of reasons why that's difficult. A lack of awareness or knowledge of what is actually possible, the cost of achieving especially deep retrofit, the disruption when you're continuing to live in the home, and other priorities for your money, even if you have the money to invest. And then for tenanted homes, there's the additional complication of what we call the split incentive, where the landlord invests, but it's the tenant that benefits from energy efficiency. So next slide, please. And then it's not necessarily that simple to make these improvements to homes. There are a number of difficulties and hurdles to get over. Choosing the best measures, the costs and benefits of those, the complexity of older buildings, particularly as a lot of older buildings are added to over time. And so even for an experienced builder, an older building can be full of surprises. So I have a picture here of a builder friend who discovered a very deep well at the house that he's working on, which is quite a nice surprise. Then there's the problem of integrating new technologies into existing buildings and services, and particularly the issue of avoiding replacing old risks with new ones, such as not enough ventilation, creating problems with moisture movement and condensation, whether it's on the surface or interstitial, and even overheating. And then realising the savings effectively in terms of user behaviour when you've made changes to a building. Next slide, please. So those are the problems. Let's now look at the positives. What are the opportunities that this situation presents? Well, we do have the technologies to improve older buildings and to achieve really deep carbon savings and energy savings to them. And energy efficiency and microgeneration technologies are improving all the time. And then there's this question about the market. How do you actually reach this market? And this is where I really want to emphasise the importance of the RMI, the repairs, maintenance and home improvement market. We estimate that in the UK, this market is worth around £11 billion just a year, just for private homes. And this is consumer-led. This is something that people want, people ask for. It's not subsidy-led, it's not driven by government policy. So it's an extraordinarily interesting route to market for making energy improvements as well. It's not subsidy dependent in any way, and so it has an opportunity to be a sustainable market. Now, when you look at what this market involves, as I say, whether it's extensions, whether it's renovations of the building broadly, whether it's rewiring, putting in new heating, new kitchens, bathrooms, all the things that people want to get done or need to get done on their homes. When you look at that, if you include energy improvements within those works, you can actually reduce the extra costs and the disruption to something that's marginal. So an example is if you were replastering an external wall, adding insulation in is a marginal additional cost, and the disruption is happening anyway. Then there's the fact that if you were bringing in that work as part of other building work, you're more likely to achieve effective integration with existing buildings and building services. And you're building on the skills and knowledge of the mainstream building trade, so you're not starting from zero in terms of people's knowledge. And as I said, I think it can be a more sustainable solution than developing a parallel green renovation industry. Next slide, please. So we should be on slide 8 now. So
correct.
This opportunity. Hello?
Correct, Catherine.
Great, that's perfect. Thank you. So now, what is this industry? Who are these people that I'm talking about? This RMI industry is mostly delivered by local building trade micro-enterprises, and these people are the first point of contact with homeowners. They have the potential to influence the customers, and they tend to have a wealth of knowledge of existing buildings. Also, a knowledge of local building characteristics. There's also the opportunity through contact with the homeowners to influence user behaviour. So my argument is that these local building trade micro-enterprises could be the front line in communicating, selling and implementing home energy improvements. Next slide, please. So you can see from this diagram, each stage in the life of a building is a potential opportunity for energy renovation, right from when it's first built through the many stages of maintenance and repair, extensive renovation which might happen every 20 to 30 years, and then finally, of course, a building will be demolished ultimately, although some of our buildings are extraordinarily old in this country. Next slide, please. Now, the building trades, when you look at who they are, they don't work in isolation. They are part of a wider system. And so in starting to think about how these organisations work, I really needed to think about all the other actors and influences in the life of the building. So in this diagram, I have the building in the centre, and then around it, all the different actors who will have an influence on that building during its life. So you've got, starting from the top and going clockwise, you have the owner, potentially a tenant. There could be a building manager in some cases. Perhaps there's an energy advisor or energy assessor involved at some stage. Planning and building control authorities, which are very often based within the local authority. Perhaps an architect has an involvement at some stage. And then, of course, the building tradespeople themselves. And then they have contact with builders, merchants and product suppliers and manufacturers. So we do need to think about all of these different range of people. And in my research, I interviewed a range of these other key actors as well. Next slide, please. So before I go on to tell you about the results of the research, I would like to just describe one particular example. And I particularly like this example because I think it illustrates so well what is possible if the builder is energy aware and notices the possibilities and acts on them. So in this situation is a tenanted building in a village in South Wales, and the tenant contacted a local builder because there was a leak in the flat roof at the back of the house, and said, would you come and fix my flat roof? The builder said, I'll come and have a look at it, do a quotation, and pointed out that there was no insulation in this flat roof and said, well, while you're recovering this roof, really it's an obvious time to have insulation put in. And then noticed that the little loft area adjoining it also didn't have any insulation in it. And it would be an easy enough thing to get access to that loft area while replacing that flat roof and to insulate that as well. So the tenant went to the landlady and said, would you be willing to pay this little bit extra to do that? And the landlady said, yes. Builder came back and he said, you know, this is quite a lot of sunshine on this roof. If you just trim down those trees over there, it's a brilliant situation to put photovoltaics. At the time, we had feed-in tariffs to encourage photovoltaics. And the landlady said, what's photovoltaics? And he explained what it was and said that she could get some money back on the feed-in tariff. And she thought about it and said, oh, yes, please. In order to do that, they had to get an energy performance certificate carried out and a couple of other small improvements on heating controls and blocking the drafts in the old chimney. So this was all done. And now we went from having a leaky flat roof to having a well-insulated, warm, dry house that's generating its own electricity. So I just thought that was a very nice example of how a simple request for a repair led to energy improvements which are much more extensive. Could we move to the next slide, please? So then start to think about what did I actually find out in the research so far. Firstly, I found out quite a lot about how building trade micro-enterprises work in practice. I discovered that in this country, at any rate, there's a tendency to work as sole traders or very, very small enterprises. When I talked to building companies about that, it seemed that some of them had been bigger in the past, but since around 2008, when there was a real dip in our construction industry, people have not really had the courage to employ a whole range of trades again. So what they do instead is they work in informal networks. So if you need a range of trades on a building, they'd bring in other people who are also sole traders or small businesses to work with them and do that on a very informal basis. A lot of the builders were very keen on staying as local as possible, and there was a lot of good reasons for that. Obviously time, cost of travel, it was also family reasons, getting home for the children, but also knowing the local suppliers and knowing the other trades to work with, so knowing the environment, and it made life an awful lot simpler. Another thing that was interesting was that people said to me they were not necessarily keen on growing their businesses. What they wanted was steady work, reliable work, and people who paid on time. They didn't necessarily want to grow a bigger business and have more responsibility. That was interesting. Also the fact that most people didn't want to do any local marketing. They got the referrals mostly on their own reputation through word of mouth recommendation. And that's very interesting, particularly because it means that the quality of their work matters enormously. That's how they get their work, and their reputation is everything to them. And then another point that was made was the high value that was placed on the reliability of products and suppliers. So supplier support on new technology when they needed to find out about something, that the suppliers, that the merchants could help them with that. And so people tended to go back to be loyal to the same merchants and the same suppliers because they developed a relationship and knew that they could rely on them to help. Next slide, please. So then I asked, what did people think about energy improvements to buildings? What was their view on that? What was their experience of including such work, whether it was insulation, better heating equipment, microgeneration, low energy lighting, any of those things to do with low energy improvements. There was quite a strong emphasis on how important building regulations, building codes are, and interest in the way that those can be applied to existing buildings, but a lot of frustration with a low level of enforcement. They don't want to feel that they're doing everything right and other builders are not, and then possibly undercutting them. And there was quite a lot of anxiety about a new thing which is happening in this country and has happened over a few years, and I believe is happening in other countries as well, where you have private building inspectors as an alternative to the local authority employed building inspectors, and a sense that perhaps those people are not quite as independent, and so that there's not the same sense of a level playing field. And this was a real worry for people. In general, though, doing low energy work was seen as putting you ahead of the game and a positive thing. There was an understanding that as time goes on, that energy rules are going to get stricter and stricter and stricter. But a number of builders said that if there was a clear path going forward for how that would happen, it would be a lot easier for them to invest their time and energy in learning the new technologies. And certainly builders merchants said that what they stocked was entirely led by the building regulations. There was a strong feeling that any financial incentives really need to be long-term and well-signalled, that short-term subsidies just create a boom-bust and a dependence, and that's not good for anybody, as it creates an unstable market. And then finally, a point about centrally imposed deadlines resulting in poor quality, where people are pushed to do the work too quickly and possibly at the wrong time of year. And a particular example that was emphasised, we ran some very large-scale external wall insulation and cavity wall insulation programs in the UK, and they were often done on annual budgets, and so people were pushed, installers were pushed to get that work done even if it wasn't really the right weather to do it, because there's a cut-off at the end of the financial year and the end of March, so you have to get going all through the winter even if it's the wrong time. Next slide, please. So what about the customer? What did the builders say about their customers, the homeowners? Well, some of them, they said, were very, very knowledgeable, but some of them extraordinarily knowledgeable. There's a fashion for running your own, being, if you like it, not exactly a DIYer, but project managing, self-build it's sometimes called, project managing your own building work. And those people were extraordinarily knowledgeable. But the others want guidance, and very often people would actually ask the first builder they ring up for the guidance about what they could do. And there's quite an ongoing dialogue then, a toing and froing to work out what can be done, to look at costs and discuss what's possible. If you are in a situation where you've been recommended by somebody else, then your opinion has got much more weight to it. And builders obviously like that because they could suggest something and the homeowner will take it up. Whereas if you're in the situation where they're having to compete with 2 or 3 other quotations, then if they added on extra energy efficiency improvements, it may be that they lose the job because it becomes more expensive. So they like the situation where they'd been recommended in a position of trust, and that's good from the point of view of sustainable energy. They then could actually give that advice and it would be taken notice of. They did say that the interest in energy and cost savings is hugely variable, that customers are very, very different. Some are quite aspirational and would really invest a lot in making their homes more environmentally friendly. Some are very interested in making them more comfortable. Other people are surprisingly not interested in it and will spend a lot of money on other things but not on that. So they have to be very careful to understand their customer and to try and find the level of interest that suits them. They did say that it would be helpful to have their own advice backed up by really specific and credible information and advice, and that the energy performance certificates, certainly in the level that they are used in this country, are really not useful enough for deep retrofit advice. In fact, sometimes they're so basic that people can see that it doesn't really describe their home well enough. They also said that initial interest in energy saving can shift as costs and options evolve. So somebody might initially say, oh, I'd really like to insulate more, I'd really like to have photovoltaics on my roof and all the rest of it. But actually, when they start to look at the costs, they might change their minds. So a lot of discussion and a lot of persuasion involved there. Next slide, please. And then I was very interested in really about the way the whole system works, what I was learning about this from the perspective of the building tradesperson. Often, it seems, in a domestic building renovation, there is no architect involved at all, or just for a very basic overall design for planning permission. And in effect, the builder fills in the gaps, doing the detailed specification, doing the project management, coordinating the trades on site. And this is quite an interesting discovery. They also pointed out that what planning told them was sometimes inconsistent with building control, which is a source of some frustration, where the planning was looking at the aesthetics, perhaps, and builder control were looking at the technical details. As I mentioned, the merchants said that they stocked very much according to demand, and that was driven by the regulations. And then another point that was made is that trade training and apprenticeships have become shorter over time. So in one way, while we're having higher expectations of our building trades in terms of administrative abilities, understanding complicated building regulations, at the same time, we're actually reducing the length of their training, and that there's a real tension there and potentially quite a serious problem. Also, that a lot of our apprenticeships now are dictated by very large employers who are more likely to put different apprentices on single tasks for a long period of time, while actually the type of small businesses that they may get work in later need a much wider range, more broadly based understanding of buildings. There was some suspicion about any kind of extra accreditations which are bought, things that are not part of your fundamental training, but you pay for later on, like your extra green label or whatever it is, that actually tends to be admin heavy and lacking in any real quality. And then finally, this fact that the homeowner tends to look for a general builder when they're needing work done on their home, but there is in this country, no specific qualification for that, which is a very curious discovery. Next slide, please. So I got interested in the role of the general builder, this rather influential person who's the first point of contact when the homeowner wants work done on their building. It'd be interesting. I'll describe what I see the general builder as. I don't even know if it's the right term, and I'd be very interested to know whether other people in other countries recognise this role and what you would call it. So what do they do? Who are they? Well, they're the first point of contact. They're the one who discusses the customer's requirements with them. They specify the detail of the work, sometimes even actually designing it, price the work, providing a quotation or an estimate. They agree the final price and the work to be done. They bring in the other trades and labour as needed, source the products and the materials, and coordinate the work on site. And they're the contact point for the homeowner throughout the work. Also dealing with any problems at the end, what we call snagging and signing it off. Next slide, please. So how do they learn to do that job? What knowledge and skills are needed? Well, firstly, general knowledge of all of the building trades, which includes construction, building services, microgeneration, often skilled perhaps in at least one construction trade so that you really understand it thoroughly. Knowledge of heat loss, ventilation requirements, moisture movement, damp problems and solutions, detailed specification and pricing, customer liaison and sales, project management, health and safety on site, coordinating works of others, people management, business management. So really a very wide-ranging skill set. And the reason I was so interested in this and what this role is and how people train to do it is because it was only by looking at that I could start to see where you could bring in the energy improvements and add those into the training if it's not already there. I didn't expect to find that the training was not actually a clear pathway in the first place. That was a real surprise. Next slide, please. So I just wanted to give you a few examples here of how some of the experienced and successful builders that I interviewed got to where they are today, how they created their own pathway to becoming general builders. So one was a carpenter who was self-employed and started bringing others in on jobs and ended up coordinating jobs, so grew his skills that way. Another one was trained as a joiner and he worked for the local authority, worked his way up to site foreman and then manager, then contracts manager, and then spent time in the private sector, foundations and building company, then renovated his own home and thought, this isn't so difficult, having done all of that, and set up his own building business, renovating homes, building around literally in his own neighbourhood, and has become, a very well-known local domestic builder in his neighbourhood. Then a completely different example, a civil engineer who'd worked on motorways and large-scale building projects, came back to this country, renovated his own home and set up his own building business. So that's an interesting one because the project management and learning technologies didn't seem particularly demanding. It was just bringing it down, if you like, to the domestic level. Then a more traditional example, I have 2 or 3 of these actually, the sons of, they tend to be sons, not daughters, the son of a small business building company owner, where in the past the father had employed all of the different trades and had maybe between 10 and 20 people working in the company. And the father specifically, thinking in terms of the son taking on the business from him, had sent him to work with different trades so that he learned the wide range, so constructed his training for him, if you like. And then another example was a quantity surveyor who worked for a large house builder, left that to manage the family damp proofing and house building business, and then set up his own small building business. So there are some examples, if you like, of the pathways that people have taken to become this general builder role in this country. Next slide, please. So I haven't analysed all of my data yet or written up the final report, but I've got a few just final thoughts I wanted to describe to you, which are where I've started to analyse. So this first one is an example of a standard RMI project process. So the customer inquiry comes into the general builder, usually leads to a site visit to discuss the wants and possibilities, then look at whether there's any building control requirements, any permissions needed, structural calculations, planning, etc. Next step is to design, specification, do an estimate or a quote, and then there's a bit of toing and froing about that until it's decided exactly what the details of the job is going to be and the price and timing. Then there's the work on site, then there's finalisation, handover, snagging, final payment, and then finally in use with possible follow-ups. So I thought it was quite interesting to do that linear description based on what builders told me. But of course, real life tends to be a bit more messy than that. That's, if you like, your perfect description, and life isn't linear usually. What really struck me when I talked to people is that there's actually no standard way of doing things in terms of domestic building work here in the UK. And as I mentioned, in particular, who designs and specifies the work and who manages and coordinates the work on site. So next slide, please. In the light of this rather informal approach, I thought it was quite interesting to look at how decision-making and risk were actually taken and shared in practice. So if you start, I've got 4 different examples here of how builders have worked with homeowners in my experience. So if you start on the top left, here we have, in the middle, the darker blob in the middle is the general builder. On the left is the other tradespeople, and on the right is the homeowner. So in this example, the general builder takes the lead, does the costing, does the project managing, and brings in the other trades as subcontractors. So the lead builder is actually doing most of the decision making and taking quite a substantial amount of risk there. So if you move along to the right, another example is where you've got groups of tradespeople who often work together, know each other, who take turns perhaps in taking that lead. And that does occur sometimes. So they're slightly more equally balanced in terms of their knowledge and experience. And then if you move down to the bottom left example, in this case, several sole traders introduce other trades to the customer, with one perhaps taking a coordinating role, but each one of them is contracted and paid separately by the customer. And that's quite a common approach, I've discovered. The point about that is that although one person is still leading on making the decisions and coordinating, the risk is shared a little bit more equally, but it does push a bit of that risk back onto the homeowner as well. And then on the bottom right, the other example is where the trades simply cross-refer to each other and the homeowner leads on coordinating everything, and so is taking much more of the risk and the decision-making responsibility. So I thought that's quite interesting, and you can start to see then why people work in different ways. That actually some homeowners want to do more of the decision-making themselves, and also some builders are more willing to take risks than others. And of course, with risk, you know, you can actually earn more potentially ultimately as well, but you're risking losing. And then one more slide, my final slide. This is my attempt at thinking, okay, if I wanted to make policy recommendations from what I've learned, how do I think things could work better? And I've based this on asking a question to the builders that I interviewed, where I asked them, if you like, the miracle question, what would you do if you were in charge? How would you change things? If you were Minister for Housing, and you could say what was going to happen in the next 10 years. So just running through this slide, if you start at the top left, one of the most important things that people said was they want the building regulations to be very clear and understandable and set clear requirements for energy improvements within repair, maintenance and home improvements. So examples of that is where you're replacing one part of a building that you have to thermally insulate when you're doing that work. And then we've also played a little bit with the concept of consequential improvements in this country, where if you're improving one part of the building, you have to improve the energy efficiency of other parts of the building, or indeed for the whole building, the energy performance for the whole building. So there are different levels at which building regulations can require energy improvements, and that can be driven through the repair, maintenance and home improvement market. Now, if you do that, if you have a clear path of building regulations, then merchants can offer the right products and backup information, because they are led very much by the building regulations. And then moving around clockwise, it's important that the government gives a clear and consistent message about the path of a future tightening of building regulations. So your pathway, your route map to the low energy and low carbon housing stock of the future. And that means that the building trades feel that they can invest in CPD, in training and equipment. Building regulations need to be communicated to the industry with reasons for why they're changing. It sounds crazy if they're not, but often it isn't the case. And manufacturers and suppliers support and training is incredibly important because it's specific to the products and it's linked to reality. Government programmes indeed should be designed to engage the local building trades, and they're really missing a trick if they don't do that. Building trade training needs to be more comprehensive and not just trade specific. So people learning building trades really need to be given a much wider understanding of energy efficiency and how the different trades link together. And I really think that the pathway to becoming a general builder in this country needs to be clearer. I'd be very interested to hear what people say about other countries. And that would lead to an improved building trade knowledge and professional status. There was a strong request for accreditations to be simple, streamlined and quality controlled and well understood. The building control personnel need to be trained and resourced to give advice so that they can actually support people in doing the right thing in terms of energy efficiency and energy improvement. Not simply policing, but enabling as well. And then finally, that if the homeowner is able to access good quality advice and assessments, then they can make the demand for energy improvement. And if all of these things happen together, then your wonderful result potentially is that you have well-informed building trades who are able to offer the full range of energy improvements. So that's my ideal scenario for the future. That's the end of my presentation. Thank you very much for your patience, and thank you so much to my